Substance dualism is a thesis that mental phenomena is fundamentally non-physical, and furthermore, that the mind is not merely a property of the physical, but is its own separate substance. Now, as with any robust philosophical thesis, substance dualism has a number of objections launched at it. In this video, we will rebut 5 common objections to substance dualism, showing that none of them render the thesis implausible, beginning with the objection from soul individuation. Let's understand the word soul to refer to the mind that is unique to every self-aware agent. With this in mind, pun intended, the objection from soul individuation can be phrased as a question. What makes qualitatively indistinguishable souls different? Let's imagine two temporally parallel souls such that every type of mental event that is initiated in one is also initiated in the other. Such souls would be exactly the same in every respect. So how can we give an informative answer about what makes one different from the other? Now, I think this objection can be answered by looking at how we differentiate physical objects. Physical objects are differentiated by their spatial location. Two tables can't occupy the same space at the same time, even if they are identical in all of their other properties. Therefore, individuating a particular table is possible because of the property of occupying a specific spatial location A is only possessed by it. But now we must ask a harder question. What differentiates one spatial region A from another spatial region B? We can't say space is constituted by the set of spatial relations between objects, since the relata seem to individuate the relation and not the other way around. The relationship that spatial region A is at the right of spatial region C seems to presuppose the numerical difference between A and C rather than account for it. So it seems like we have to hold that space is an independent substance whose identity conditions don't depend on any other material object or their relationships. But if this is true, it is impossible to differentiate spatial regions by material objects, because the identity of the latter is taken to be dependent on the former. So just as the materialist can say, spatial location A is numerically different from spatial location B, because spatial location A has the property of being identical to spatial location A, and spatial location B lacks that property, the substance dualist can likewise say soul A is numerically different from soul B, because soul A has the property of being identical to soul A, and soul B lacks that property. If it is legitimate for the materialist to make this move when differentiating space, it is legitimate for the substance dualist to make this move when differentiating souls. But what about non-spatial forms of dualism? Philosopher Jose Rodriguez provides a good answer in his paper, "There are no good objections to substance dualism." Non-spatial substance dualists can answer that soul A is numerically different from soul B because soul A causally interacts with brain A and soul B with brain B. So either way, the objection can be answered. Next up is the objection from causal pairing. This objection is based on the work of philosopher of mind Wang Kim and is aimed at non-spatial dualism. We can clarify what this objection is through the following analogy. There is a situation involving two guns, A and B, which are fired at the same time, resulting in the simultaneous death of Adam and Bob. The inevitable question is, what makes it the case that the firing of A caused Adam's death and the firing of B caused Bob's death, and not the other way around? Answering this question requires appealing to the different spatial relationships between the gun and their targets. This will result in different spatial trajectories of the bullets, which explain the death of the respective persons. Now let's turn to a scenario where the Cartesian souls are the causal agents. Soul A wills for an arm to move upwards, and Soul B has the same wish at the same time. Adam and Bob's arms simultaneously move upwards. Assuming that Soul A is paired with Adam's body and Soul B with Bob's body, the challenge is to explain what accounts for this pairing relationship. Why is it that a certain soul mental acts cause changes in one body, rather than in the other body? What can be said to answer this objection? Well, the first thing to note is that the objection seems to assume the following principle, call it GC. Merely numerical differences can't ground differences in causal relationships. It's worth noting, as Rodriguez does in his paper, that people already committed to libertarian free will should reject GC. since prominent libertarian theories reject it. But in any case, philosopher Michael Tooley has produced two counterexamples to GC. Let's start with case 1. Assume a universe of three objects, A, B, and C. Object A is 2 meters away from object B, and object C is 2 meters away from object B in the opposite symmetrical direction. Object A and object B share all their non-Hesiatist properties except their spatial location. Either of the two objects has a 2% chance of causing an object to crack when they are 2 meters away from it. Object B cracks. Most likely, either only A did it or only C did it. Now, how do we decide? We can't appeal to their different spatial locations since they are the same distance from the relevant object, so it seems like we have to accept that their bare numerical difference is responsible for one of them having had a causal impact while the other didn't. That was Tooley's first counterexample. He also gives us a second as stated before. The second one goes as follows. There is a property P such that if X possesses it, he will bring about either Q or R. There is another property M such that if X possesses it, he will also bring about either Q or R. An object A that has both P and M and acquires both Q and R. Was it having property P or having property M that was the cause of the acquisition of Q and R? We have two states of affairs, A having P and A having M, which relevantly differ only in their non-Hesiatist properties. What makes it the case that the A having P is responsible for A having Q, rather than A having M? These two counterexamples provide ample reason to reject GC. Furthermore, spatial dualists can avoid the argument from causal pairing by holding that souls are causally paired with the brains they are co-located with. This does not beg the question, since if we agree with GC, and the dualist is already committed to soul-brain causation, it can be inferred that souls are in the brain in a non-ad hoc manner. Thus, the dualist has a sound reply to this objection. Now we come to the objection from mind-body causation, otherwise known as the interaction problem. This objection questions the assertion that the irreducible mind can causally interact with the physical body. But in the first place, why think that causality makes mind-body interaction problematic? What is it about immaterial minds that makes it harder for interaction with the physical to be possible? Rodriguez reminds us that physics gives us numerous examples of very different things interacting with each other. Fields and particles, singularities, black holes, forces and charges, etc. In fact, it seems intuitively obvious that my intention in raising my hand plays a causal role in my hand actually being raised, and it is equally obvious that my belief that it is raining outside plays a causal role in me taking an umbrella outside. So prima facie, mind-body causation seems possible. Now, some people might argue mind-body causation is impossible based on a theory of causation which states that A caused B only if there is some property that A transferred to B. However, Rodriguez gives us good counterexamples to this theory. One example being an interruption of blood flow to the brain, which causes its fainting, or another one, turning off a switch to turn the light off. Clearly no energy is being transferred since the light switch is off. Furthermore, substance dualists like Hart actually believe souls have energy, so this principle, even if true, might not be a problem for such theories. Regardless, the objection from mind-body causation does not pose a serious problem for substance dualism by any stretch of the imagination. The fourth objection I will cover is the objection from the neural dependency of the mind. There are correlations between brain states and mental states, and furthermore, the mind, in some sense, seems to be dependent on the brain. This is seen in cases like Phineas Gage, where damage to the brain resulted in damages to the mind. How can substance dualism address this? I think this objection can be addressed by appealing to the transductor hypothesis. Rodriguez gives a pretty good summary of this thesis. In short, it is the thesis that human brains are necessary to convert the coarse-grained information that the sensory organs receive to the highly fine-grained visual, auditory, and tactile information that is characteristic of human minds, and further, that the brain is also necessary for the mind to realize complex mental operations, just like calculators are needed for normal people to do heavy arithmetic. The brain would be like a massive computer which brings the necessary sensory information to the mind, and through its considerable computational power, amplifies its cognitive powers. Maybe brain's architecture is necessary for everyday cognitive skills, but that does not mean it is necessary for every intentional activity of the soul. It's worth noting that this hypothesis is not ad hoc. I covered in my video on the argument for God from consciousness how brain states are not always correlated with mental states. In fact, they are underdetermined. So we have strong reason to reject the idea that brain states determine mental states. Beyond this, philosopher Mark Barker argues that the creative aspect of language use is purely soul-based. Given dualism, taking into account that unlike the two other parts of the language faculty, the lexicon and the grammar parts, the creative aspect of language use isn't related to any sort of localized brain damage, and no genetic defect affects it. It is therefore reasonable to believe that the soul is fully responsible for it. Which capacities the soul can do on its own and which capacities it needs a brain for would thus become an empirical issue. So the substance dualist again has a sound response to this objection. The last objection I will cover is the objection from parsimony. The objection from parsimony contends that substance dualism violates Occam's razor. That is, substance dualism postulates entities that are not needed to explain reality. I think this is mistaken. Mental states cannot be reduced to physical states, as I've argued in my last video on indeterminacy, and mental states must be causally efficacious on the physical to avoid the evolutionary argument against naturalism, as I argued on my video from the consciousness argument for God. These facts strongly support a substance dualist position on the mind, since it rules out both materialist and epiphenomenalist theories. I can go even further by arguing that the mind cannot merely be a property or process, as property dualists hold to, however. Consider solipsism. Premise 1. If solipsism is possible, then a possible world exists where only the mind exists. Premise 2. Solipsism is possible. Conclusion 1. So a possible world exists where only the mind exists. Premise 3. Possible worlds cannot only consist of properties, but must also include things. Right? You can't have a world with properties without things that have said properties. Therefore, conclusion 2. The mind is not a property, hence property dualism is false. So not only is the mental irreducible to the physical, the mental is not simply a property of the physical. So substance dualism is far from unparsimonious. And with that, the last objection we will cover in this video can be dismissed. So, as we have seen, no objection is cause for concern among substance dualists. Substance dualism remains a very plausible position.